It's Yud Gimel Sivan. Echad. Echad. Aleph Ches Daled is 13. And we're learning Hayom. Now the last time we learned was 2 weeks ago. And we did the entry of Lamed Menachem. In other words, it's at page Pei Gimel. If you have page Pei Dalet, turn back to page Pei Gimel. It's the second one from the bottom. Last time we learned, the shir was divided into 2 parts. Half of the shir was the minhagim. We spoke about David Hashem Oiri and blowing shofar, the first day of Shchei Shalol, and so on. The second part of the shir, we began to read about this entry in the Hayom. I'm going to go straight to the entry. See, it says Admor HaZaken. That apparently is a mistake. It's supposed to be Admor HaEmtsoi. The Mitteler Rebbe Hayom Betchil Mamorim Ktsarim said originally short Maimorim. For example, the Beramaschel Zecher Av Tuvcha B'Yurish B'Sidde, the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe in Sidde Zecher Av Tuvcha, Nemru B'Shishem Sheichim. The Mitteler Rebbe said over the course of 6 intervals. Bariches Yesek Tas Meinitva is a little bit more elaborate in the way it's printed. So the first thing is, it shouldn't say Admor HaZaken, it should say Admor HaEmtsoi. So 2 weeks ago when we learned this, I gave you a little bit of history about the Siddur. The Alter Rebbe's Siddur was written by the Mitteler Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe's Siddur was written by the Mitteler Rebbe. And I explained to you that the Mitteler Rebbe, when he wrote them, one of the Alter Rebbe wrote them in his own signet, wrote them in his own style. I mean, the Mitteler Rebbe used to write one of the Alter Rebbe with his own commentary on it. And I told you the history, that the Alter Rebbe was very particular about Lashon Harav. The Alter Rebbe wanted his Chassidim to write what he says word for word. And a Chassid who didn't write precisely the wording of the Alter Rebbe was very makbid. The Alter Rebbe was very particular about that. And one of the greatest Chassidim ever, Rabban Alevi, Mistrashel, Rabban Alevi Horowitz, Mistrashel, Rabban Strashel. The Alter Rebbe was very critical of him, that he wrote the Maimorim with his own explanation. And Alter Rebbe didn't let him, and he punished him for doing it. And Rabban Strashel's complaint was, what about your son, the Mitteler Rebbe? That the Mitteler Rebbe did write Maimorim with his own beard. And of course the answer is, Rabban Strashel was, like the Frierdiker Rebbe once said, Harav HaTzadik, Harav HaGon, Harav HaKodesh, aber nicht Rebbe. He was a Tzadik and a Gon and a Kodesh. But he was not a Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe was very makbid about Rabban Strashel, but the Mitteler Rebbe, whom the Alter Rebbe used to call, his son, Mein Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe used to call the Mitteler Rebbe Mein Rebbe. In the later years, Alter Rebbe's Nesias, if a person had a shaila in Yana Yavoida, a question about matters of Ruchnius, so he would come to the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe would say, "Geh zu Mein Rebbe," go to my Rebbe, meaning his son, the Mitteler Rebbe. Could you imagine that? So the Mitteler Rebbe used to write the Maimorim B'Signeni. After the Alter Rebbe passed away, the Mitteler Rebbe prepared and published the Alter Rebbe's Pirush HaMilson Tefillah. It's printed. The Alter Rebbe said it, and now it was retyped in ACS Mirobois. You can now buy it in 2 volumes, beautifully laid out. So, what the Mitteler Rebbe did, from what I remember from the Pesach Dover of the Siddur was, the Mitteler Rebbe had the Hanochas of Maimorim and Siddur that the Alter Rebbe wrote that he had prepared. The Mitteler Rebbe took the Hanochas, took the transcripts of the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, which he prepared, and rewrote them for the Siddur. And rewriting them for the Siddur, he made them shorter. The Mitteler Rebbe actually made them more concise, because he wanted to make them in such a way that it's like a Pirush HaMilas. So I was thinking that that's the meaning of these words, that the Maimer Zecher Av Tuvcha, which is in the Siddur, the Mitteler Rebbe said over many intervals, Barichus Yesek Tzas Mehanitfas. But the way he said it is longer than the way it's printed. And I'm going to guess, without knowing, that we probably today have, also in print, the longer version of that Maimer. Because the Mitteler Rebbe wrote the Maimer B'Signeni as he understood it. When he put it in the Siddur, he made it shorter. But now all the Maimorim are published. So Mistama, they have the Ksav, or a copy, a hetek, of the Maimer of Zecher Av Tuvcha, as the Mitteler Rebbe wrote it, in addition to how the Mitteler Rebbe put it in Siddur. And that's the meaning of these words, that the Mitteler Rebbe used to when he wrote the Siddur, took his father's Maimon that he had written and shortened them. But when he became a Rebbe, and he repeated them to Chassidim, he said them in his signet, he said them longer. That's how I explained this to you 2 weeks ago. Now I have here, there's a sefer which is recently published, and I would advise people to buy it. It's called Hayom HaMavur. I wouldn't say that this is the work of a genius. It's a work of a worker, and sometimes workers are more better than geniuses, right? Geniuses have no patience. I don't know who prepared the sefer, but they redid it, they did it well. Every single Hayom they bring you background information. For the Menachem, they bring you background information from the Rebbe's letters, and from the Rebbe's siches, and from the Rebbe's notes on the Siddur, and so on. And for the entries, they bring you the sources. The Rebbe made the Hayom based on the Frierdiker Rebbe's quotes, from his Maimorim, from his siches, from his letters, and from the Rishimis, from the private conversations the Rebbe had with the Frierdiker Rebbe. Today, all of that is printed, or at least a large percentage of it is printed. And the Rebbe, when he printed the Hayom, when the Rebbe printed the Hayom, he took one copy, and for every day he wrote his own source. The Rebbe in his own home, the Rebbe in his house, had an original Hayom from Dafshin Gimel, and for each day he wrote in the makar of that date. So the particulars are not so negeya, but somebody found out that in the Rebbe's house that Hayom exists. And through a series of negotiations, the Rebbe was asked to give it out. I understand that the Rebbe was a little bit unhappy that people knew about it. How do people know what's going on in his house? But the Rebbe gave it out. And in Tafshir and Aleph, 31 years ago, Rabbi Zellickson, Michal Zellickson, who has this chus, a big chus when it comes to the Hayom, printed the Hayom with all of these notes. If you look on your page, on the bottom, these notes the Rebbe himself wrote. At the bottom of each page, you have Mara Makoimis. The brackets were added later, but the source of each entry the Rebbe wrote himself in the original print of the Hayom. And in 1991, the Rebbe gave it out, so we should be able to trace the sources. So the malaket of this sefer simply looked at those sources and published them. So on this entry, there's a very interesting story, which of course you would never know by looking at the entry, and I'm going to start today's class by sharing that story with you. We know that in Tov Kuf Nuntes, the Alter Rebbe was arrested. 1798, the Alter Rebbe was arrested. When the Rebbe came back from prison, the Alter Rebbe called in a number of people, and he told them that the reason I was arrested is because when I say Chassidus, I don't explain it well enough, and therefore only Yechidei Segula understand what I'm saying, and the regular people cannot understand, and this is the reason for the Kitru. That's what he said. That's what I read here now, and it's a Sikh of the Frierdiker Rebbe, I believe. That the Alter Rebbe called in a number of people, and he told them that the reason for the arrest was because I'm explaining Chassidus on a level where, in the wording of the Rebbe, nor Yechidei Segula verstehen. Only in the rare individuals, it should be understood by everybody, not just Yechidei Segula. This is a Reshima from Frierdiker Rebbe. I'm just telling you my source. It's a Reshima from Frierdiker Rebbe, which is printed in Sefer Maram Tafshin Tes. And the Alter Rebbe said that I was arrested because I'm teaching Chassidus and not everybody understands. And the Alter Rebbe decided that he wants to create a shir, a framework, where he's going to explain Chassidus much more comprehensively, that everybody should understand. So we took 6 people, a very small group. And that small group consisted of the Mitteler Rebbe, his other sons of Chaim Avram and Reb Moshe, and a number of elder Chassidim. And he began to say, Maimor Chassidus, Tov Kuf Nun Tes, we're using a lot of misholim that they should be understood even by people with what you and I would call common minds, ordinary minds. Einfach, I mentioned, regular people should understand it. And one of the Maimorim that he said was this Maimor Zecher Av Tuvcha. And in the Maimor he spoke very tifa haskalas, very deep in Yonim, with a bunch of misholim. And the Alter Rebbe had each one of these 6 or 7 people write it down. And he looked at their various different hanochas. And the Alter Rebbe wanted to see how they understood what he was saying. And then he said a second Maimer to explain the first Maimer that should understand it better. In other words, the Alter Rebbe understood by reading their notes what it was that they were missing, and he was masbid. So this is a Maimer with a long history, Vimazach. It's a long history. But what's negate to us is the Mitteler Rebbe. The Mitteler Rebbe. The Mitteler Rebbe, we've talked about this in other Hayom games as well. We've also talked about this on his birthday and his Yom. The Mitteler Rebbe, all of his dates come together. Tes Yud Kislev is his birthday, his arrest, and his Istalkus, all in one chunk. But over the years, we've had many opportunities to talk about the Mitteler Rebbe. The Mitteler Rebbe was a Yid who swam in the sea of Chassidus. Oysa Chassidus hat gonish nie gewusst. The Mitteler Rebbe knew nothing but Chassidus. You know that the Mitteler Rebbe told the Badisha Verov, when the Mitteler Rebbe was born, he wanted to give him a name Hamnuna, which means secret, Geheimnis, secret. He named him Berel, Dave Ber, because the Rebbe, the Maggid, stood next to me, the Alter Rebbe said, and he insisted that I should name him after me, after him. But the Alter Rebbe said about his son, the Mitteler Rebbe, that this is Nune Yame da Azla B'Yabeshte, fish from the sea walking on the dry land. There's such a fish that they have lungs, they can walk on the dry land. There are fish from the sea, that means Neshamas Malma Deskasye, souls that live in a world which is Kule Epinemius, and they come into this world just as they were in Gan Eden. So the Neshamas Lachatchila V'Shaychas only to Pnimius, only to say this Atera, Pnimius Atera. And the Mitteler Rebbe was such an Neshama. When the Alter Rebbe Mitteler was Nestalik, I've told you the story many times, that the night of his Histalkos, he was sitting with Chassidim, and he went into a trance, and the Chassidim panicked. They couldn't understand what was going on, and they started to scream. And what they were saying is, the Rebbe should not do this in front of the Chassidim. When the Mitteler Rebbe went into a panic, into a trance, he was like a marble. He didn't budge. He was not in this world at all. The Chassidim were screaming to the Mitteler Rebbe, Chassidim cannot witness this. They're not keilah for this. The Rebbe shouldn't do this in front of the Chassidim. And they were hysterical. They were making noise. They were banging the furniture. When the Mitteler Rebbe finally sat up, the Chassidim asked the Rebbe if he heard what they were saying. And the Chassidim said, yeah. The Mitteler Rebbe said, yeah, ich hab gehört. Was tut azah heichen ishom in azah niedrige Welt. What is such a great soul doing in such a lowly world? He heard something altogether different. When the Alter Rebbe was alive, his chayes was Chassidus. Like when he had to get married, his father asked him, which shidduch do you want? He said, I want to marry the girl who's ready to marry me the quickest, because when I get married, my father's going to say extra Mamar Chassidus. That was the Mitteler Rebbe. His life was Chassidus. He wanted once a beer from the Alter Rebbe on a Maimed, and the Alter Rebbe hesitated, so he became physically ill, physically sick. His life was Chassidus. The Tzemach Tzedek said about the Mitteler Rebbe, aber weil geschnitten bei dem Rebbe, dem schwer der Finger. If you had cut the finger of my father-in-law, the Rebbe, the Mitteler Rebbe, wird nicht gegangen in Blut, weil gegossen Chassidus. Blood wouldn't flow. Chassidus flow. His life was cool like Chassidus. Cool like Chassidus. I personally don't think that it literally means that Chassidus would flow. But some people, I'm sure, would say, what's wrong with literally? You live on blood. He lives on Chassidus. We can't understand that because we need to eat and sleep and drink because we're people. This is Andezach, but I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what it means. When the Mitteler Rebbe became a Rebbe, so there's verschiedene Aussprachen, there's different expressions. One of the expressions was the Zalman Zezmir. That the B'Hillel Parasher said of Zalman Zezmir, the Vilde Balimoich, the B'Hillel Parasher, a wild mind, a crazy mind. Rav Zalman Zezmir said, "When the Rebbe was nostalgic, Chassidus Chabad is over. Mer ken Chassidus it nit zayin. Whatever the Alter Rebbe gave us, we have, and it's over." And the Mitteler Rebbe said, "Was? Mer ken Chassidus vet nit zayin. Ich will reden und ich will reden, na da sheyetze meyapchem. I'm going to speak and speak till it's coming out of your noses," which is Bashkocha Pratis in the Parsha of this week, Parsha Ba'aleischa. But the Maise of the Slav, Ada sheyetze meyapchem, but over there it was the Greyese. And here it's the Malyusa, ich will reden und ich will reden, Ada sheyetze meyapchem. I'm going to speak and speak till it's coming out of your noses. And the Mitteler Rebbe became a Rebbe. He was Rebbe for 15 years. The shortest Nesias. The shortest Nesias. The Rebbe Marash was a Rebbe for how many years? 16 or 17 years. 17 years. 18 years if you want to push it. But it seems much longer. The Mitteler Rebbe's Nesius was 15 years, and it was concentrated. My imagining, my dimyan, when I think about the Mitteler Rebbe's Nesius, I almost feel like the Mitteler Rebbe for 15 years took people, took human beings on this earth, and he took them to a different world. He wasn't a Rebbe in this world, he was someplace else. For the 15 years of the Nesius of the Mitteler Rebbe took hundreds of young Leute, not one or two, hundreds of men, hundreds, maybe thousands. And he raised them to a madrege that a haskola, a hisbonenus, and haskola fazek zib mishor given a dover shal mabakach. They could concentrate on haskola of Chassidus for 6 hours and it was no big deal. He transformed human beings intellectually to appreciate Chassidus on the level of chokhmah bina vadas in such a high level. The Friedrich Rebbe says about the Mitteler Rebbe's Chassidim, as the Mitteler Rebbe's Chassidim hat nicht ausgefällt Mashiach. The Mitteler Rebbe's Chassidim were not lacking Mashiach. The Mitteler Rebbe used to say, mein Taive is, als zwei junge Leute wollen sich treffen, soll man reden, Yechudi Allah. My lust is, my desire is, my wish is, my hope is that when two Chassidim meet, they should talk Elokus, they speak Yechudi Allah. So the Mitteler Rebbe's Nesius was a very unusual thing, even in the world of Chabad, which is a deeper, more pneumistic, more intellectual Chassidus. The Mitteler Rebbe was not in this world. He was literally not in this world. And he took all these people with him on this journey into a place of alakus and seichel that's unimaginable, not before and not after. The Friedrich Rebbe said the Mitteler Rebbe Chassidim were not missing Mashiach, they had Mashiach, they lived in a different universe. Nevertheless, in those short 15 years, there's a lot of stages. In the beginning, it was normal. It started off normal. You have to remember, the Alter Rebbe ran away from Hadich, from Piena, right? Hadich, Piena, where he passed away. And when the Alter Rebbe was nostalgic, the family was broken. And the Mitteler Rebbe was questioning where he should settle. And it took him a while. The Mitteler Rebbe came to Lubavitch in the end of Tavkuf Gimel. In other words, 6 or 7 months after his father passed away, he decided to move back to Lubavitch. You must understand, the Alter Rebbe was Rebbe in Ladi. It's a whole other part of Russia. The Mitteler Rebbe's decision to go back to Lubavitch is right next door to Lyozny. It's 10 kilometers apart, 10 viyars. It's very close. Lyozny, which we call today Belarus here, White Russia. And he decided to move back to the Mitteler Rebbe, to where the Alter Rebbe founded Chassidus Chabad. Alter Rebbe was raised, Alter Rebbe learned Teda in Lubavitch. And the Mitteler Rebbe settled in Lubavitch, and Lubavitch became the Ir Abira, became the capital city of Chassidus Chabad, as the Rebbe Rashab would say later, for 101 years, or for 102 years, or for 103 years, for over 100 years, from the times of the Mitteler Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Marash, and the Rebbe Rashab. Lubavitch was the Ir Abira of Chassidus. Lubavitch was the capital city of Chassidus. And in Lubavitch began to be made a Oir Godel, Mitteler Rebbe. But in the beginning there was a schedule. He would say Chassidus Shabbos, or whenever he said Chassidus, and the Chassidus lasted for a measured amount of time. And the Mitteler Rebbe began to prove to Reb Zalman Zezmir as noch da Nayes. The Mitteler Rebbe added so much to what the Alter Rebbe said. And now go back to the Hayom and read it again. Admor Ho'am Tzoi, it says Azokin. It should be Amor the Mitteler Rebbe. Hayom Betchilam, when he became a Rebbe, he said short my morim. How do you say short my morim if everything you write is long? The Teretz says you make it into Hemsheichim. 1 week he said one piece, another week he said it took him 6 weeks to say one Maimah because the Maimah was long. It was long. So he said it short. He wanted the Chassidim to be able to help cup. And of course, and remember, the Mitteler Rebbe also printed his Chassidus. During the course of the Nesius of the Mitteler Rebbe printed 10 of his own Sfarim. And the Chassidim, the Rebbe spoke once for bringing that the Chassidim of the Mitteler Rebbe were so poor they couldn't afford to buy a Sefer. So when the Mitteler Rebbe printed his Sfarim, hat er sie nicht gebunden, he didn't bind them. Because if you bind the Sefer, you have to buy the whole book. But if you didn't buy the Sefer, you could buy one Machberes. You know how printed books go. You look at any Sefer, it has a bunch of folders, like Machberes, like notebooks, together, and you string them together, you weave, you string it, you sew it together, and you make a Sefer. So the Mitteler Rebbe sold his Sfarim in individual Machberes. So let's say a Sefer like the Ateres Reish, let's say, which is 10 Machberes, 10 little pamphlets, 10 little notebooks. One chassid bought one, other chassid, and they would exchange it. They would share it because they couldn't afford to buy a complete sefer. That's how poor they were. And the Rebbe added that the Mitteler Rebbe used to write the price of each machberes on the machberes, how much it cost. Because when you write a price, you give the sefer to Chassidus. And he printed 10 of his Sfarim, and the Nusach HaYedua, that each sefer was printed for a different sug of Chassidim, the 3 Chalakim, the Shari Tshuva, and the Peresh Amilis, and the Mirei Bina, and all the rest. And 2 of his Sfarim were for everybody. The Shari Eid is called the Aleph Beis of Chassidus. The Sefer of Chanukah and Purim called Shari Eid is the Aleph Beis. And the Shari Yichud is called the Maftech, it's called the Index. And the Mitteler Rebbe, B'chayav printed it with Mefashim his Chassidus. But over the years of his Nasias, things changed. The story was that after being a Rebbe for 7 years, one of his Chassidim said to the Mitteler Rebbe that the Mitteler Rebbe is teaching them what Chabad is. So the Mitteler Rebbe said, no. Everything I taught you until now is Mer Nishvi Hagdoma. Everything I taught you until now is only the introduction. Now I'm going to teach you what Chabad is. And over the course of the Nasias of the Mitteler Rebbe, the things changed in 2 ways. Number 1, the Maimonim stopped being short, they became longer. By the time Mitteler Rebbe was nostalgic, he could say Chassidus for hours and hours without stopping. Hours and hours without stopping. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes in the Rishima that there was one Simchas Torah that there was no time to make hakafos. Because the Mitteler Rebbe said a maimed, and before they could catch their breath, he said a second maimed, and before they could catch their breath, so they made hakafos Isru Chag. After, there was no time, with no Chassidus. Ownership for many hours. Many hours. There's a famous vort, which is not from the Rabbein, but it's in the Sipur Chassidim, that the Maril was the Tzemach Tzedek's son. But the Maril was really a chassid of his grandfather, of the Mitteler Rebbe. It took him 15 years, 15 years to become a chassid of his own father, the Maril. Because it was Mekusha to his grandfather, to the Mitteler Rebbe. So the Maril once boasted, Barabim, Gelebt Hashem Yisbarach 15 Jahr Mishamer gewend dem Seiden. He said, I thank God for 15 years I served my grandfather. Because they had what was called a stender. A stender means a lectern, what you lean on. Now I'm not sure whether this means that the Rebbe physically leaned on him, or it means that the Rebbe would say the Maimon to him. All the Lubavitcher Rebbeim, except for our Rebbe, said Chassidus with their eyes open. And when they would say Chassidus, they would look into the eyes of one Chassid. And in Lubavitch, there's descriptions from Falak Khan, it could be also from Yudel Chitrik, about the Rebbe Rashab would say, "Am I Chassidus?" looking at the Frierdiker Rebbe. And if the Frierdiker Rebbe was away, he would choose another Chassid. Sometimes it was our Rebbe's father, Rebbe Leivik. Sometimes it was our Rebbe's grandfather, the Rebbe Baruch Schneier. And the Rebbe would say the Maimon to them. So I don't know when we call by the Mitteler Rebbe a standard, whether it means he leaned on him or he spoke to him. So the Maril boasted, Baruch Hashem, Mishamik V'nam Zayden, I was served my grandfather for 15 years. So the Rebbe Marash says, what? What did you do that makes you a Mishamish of the Rebbe? He says, what do you mean? The Rebbe said Chassidus for an hour, for 2, and he leaned on me. So the Rebbe Marash said, Und der Farbe bist du a stender? For that you call yourself the lectern, the leaning post of the Rebbe, because he leaned on you as Chassidus for 2 hours? Someone said, no, but one time it was for 4 hours. Now the Rebbe Marash was pushing the envelope because he knew the end of the story. And each time his brother would boast, he would say, no, so 6 hours you leaned on him, big deal. 8 hours. Until I saw in one gear says 17 hours. Another gear I saw 18 hours. In succession. Non-stop. He leaned on his grandson and spoke Chassidus. And it was not telling stories. It was Tifa Haskalah. And this was a man who was born with bad lungs. He was born with bad lungs. 18 hours. He had Chassidus on over. So by the time the Nasias, the Mitteler was over, it was you were swimming in the Lakus. It was completely chaotic. And the wonder isn't that the Rebbe can speak Chassidus 17 hours. That's not the wonder. The Chassidim can't mithalten. You know, if a Rebbe speaks Chassidus 17 hours, no one knows what he's talking about. It's like pouring water into a cup with a hole. The Chassidim got it. The Mitteler Rebbe raised up his Chassidim's madrega because of their concentration so much that they could stay on the train with the Rebbe all those hours and keep their head and be able to not just get some details of the Maimon, but get the whole Maimon. And all of that is hinted in these few lines. In the beginning of the Nasias, my Maimonim they were shorter. In the beginning of the Nasias, my Maimonim had a Seder. Then it all changed, and I would imagine they became a Rebbe Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel. So I guess the first 7 years was normal till Ayin Tes or Tov Kuf Pei, and then it changed. And the Mitteler Rebbe began to say Chassidus with a shefa she'ein kamoi, on ashir, no limit. And the no limit is in 2 pratim. Number 1, he said for many, many hours. And number 2, there was no set times. There was a ma'aseh that happened here in America, that the Rebbe once verbringt Shabbos Tes Kislev, Tov Shin Chof Beis. Mrs. Engels of Gesundsein, who comes here occasionally, it was her ufruf. She got married that Shabbos. And the Rebbe said 3 Maimorim in 1 Fabrengen. 3, not 2, 3. And they're long Maimorim. Maimorim are now printed. I think we have all 3 of them. One of them is Muga, called the B'Shalom. And the Rebbe said, why is he saying 3 Maimorim? It's because by the Mitteler Rebbe, sometimes you had Chassidus 3 times in 1 Shabbos. And the Rebbe said that the Mitteler Rebbe sometimes in Mitnacht, in fact, Losner Ruf and the Chassidim, he would wake up and sit in the middle of the night because he wanted to say Chassidus, and he would say Chassidus. So that Shabbos was a very short Shabbos. Tes Kislev was a very short Shabbos, the middle of the winter. The Rebbe verbringt Shabbos. He said 3 Memorah Chassidus in 1 Shabbos, and after Shabbos, nobody went home. Because the Rebbe spoke about the Mitteler Rebbe saying Chassidus in the middle of the night, everyone was afraid the Rebbe said Chassidus in the Mitternacht. So the Rebbe walked out of his room late. The Rebbe in those days, the Rebbe probably went home 12 o'clock. They walked out of his room in the middle of the night, and the shul is full. He said, what's everybody doing here? So they told the Rebbe that the Rebbe said that the Mitteler Rebbe said Chassidus in the middle of the night, they don't want to miss it. So the Rebbe told them, aber hat lassen rufen. If he said Chassidus in the middle of the night, he sent a shliach to wake him up. He didn't just say Chassidus and expect them to know Beruach HaKedesh. Why do you have to wait around, But this happened. But the Mitteler Rebbe, it was normal Chassidus. So one of the effects of this was that the Tzemach Tzedek stopped coming to the Maimorim. Tzemach Tzedek was the Mitteler Rebbe's son-in-law. And when the Mitteler Rebbe became a Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek did not want to be in Lubavitch. He wanted to be in someplace else. And the reason he gave was he wanted to learn in Davin, and he knew that he was going to be by the Mitteler Rebbe, he's going to schlep him into Askonis. And the Mitteler Rebbe told the Tzemach Tzedek, I promised you I will leave you alone. I won't bother you at all. You'll be free to learn in Davin, do whatever you want. I just want you to be near me. And the Tzemach Tzedek agreed. And the Mitteler Rebbe Taka left him alone. The one thing that the Tzemach Tzedek had to do for the Mitteler Rebbe was to answer the Shalos of Tshuvas and Nigla. Because the Alter Rebbe wrote Tshuvas and Nigla, Tzemach Tzedek wrote Tshuvas and Nigla, the Merat wrote Tshuvas and Nigla. But the Mitteler Rebbe didn't. Even though the Reged Shaveh said about the Mitteler Rebbe that there's Ga'ana Go'inim, he's a bigger Go'an than the Alter Rebbe, if you can imagine such a thing. But he didn't write Tshuvas and Nigla. And he said, I don't have time. And the reason I don't have time is my ganze She'ife is, my whole hope is, my whole wish is, my whole Chayes is, as 2 junge Leute sollen sich treffen, sollen wir reden Yechudi Law, Atikanarich, 2 young men should meet, they should speak in Yonim and Chassidus. So the Mitteler Rebbe said to the Tzemach Tzedek, I'm not going to bother you at all, except for one thing. I don't have time to write the Tshuvas and Nigla, so this you'll do for me. And the Tzemach Tzedek agreed, and he would write the Tshuvas, and he would show them to the Mitteler Rebbe, and the Mitteler Rebbe never made a comment. Never once made a comment. Until one time there was a rush, it was an emergency. So the Tzemach Tzedek made a cheshbon that since the Rebbe the Shver, the Mitteler Rebbe never ever makes corrections anyway, I'll send it without his seeing it, and later I'll show it to him. So when he showed it to the Mitteler Rebbe told the Tzemach Tzedek, Hast farzen a tesis, you overlooked the tesis. And the Mitteler Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek thought about it, and he remembered the tesis, and he had a gvaldige chalisha sadas. He was very broken. He says, the Rebbe the Shver looked at the tshuva, he wasn't even in the sugi, he just looked at it and he found my mistake. Me and my chavrus, Reb Chaim Debrovna, worked days on that tshuva, and we made a mistake. So the Mitteler Rebbe saw how broken-hearted the Tzemach Tzedek was, so he told him, B'zeh Lashon, Zorg sich nicht, du bist noch nicht kein Rebbe, don't feel bad, you're not a Rebbe yet. Meaning once you're a Rebbe, the position, the Chassidim will protect you. Now with Shaychat, there should be an infant toes. So the Tzemach Tzedek was in Lubavitch, and when the Mitteler Rebbe said, my Menachem Chassidus, he would send the shliach to call, and Tzemach Tzedek would come and sit on the bimah, stand on the bimah. Derech Agav, there's a maaseh that one day the Mitteler Rebbe called in 2 of his Chassidim and said, go to my Eidim, my son-in-law Mendel, and tell him to come to me. Tell him I want to speak to him. And if he refuses to come, drag him by the gartel and bring him to me Balkorch. So they came to the Tzemach Tzedek's house in Lubavitch, they knocked on the door, Tzemach Tzedek opened the door, and they told him that the Rebbe the Shver Ruf, the Rebbe the father-in-law is calling. And the Tzemach Tzedek walked, he wasn't going. So they grabbed him by the gartel and they schlepped him to the Mitteler Rebbe. When he came into the Mitteler Rebbe, the Mitteler told him one thing. Wie viel der Shir atzne alechts? How much is the limit of your secrecy, of your hiding? And then he closed his door. That was the whole message. Wie viel der Shir atzne alechts? How much are you going to hide yourself? And then he closed the door. Tzemach Tzedek went home. The Mitteler Rebbe's protest. Wie viel der Shir atzne alechts? But when the Rebbe started saying longer my mother Chassidus, ubi ikir, when he started saying the Mitteler Rebbe, without a seder, that Tzemach Tzedek stopped coming. He didn't come. And the Chassidim couldn't believe it. The Rebbe, the Shvei, your father, the Rebbe saying Chassidus and you don't come. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, I need a schedule. I can't be like this day and night on Ashir. So he stopped coming. When the Tzemach Tzedek became a Rebbe, he started saying Chassidus normal, on a clock and with a limit and with a schedule. And the Mitteler Rebbe Chassidim couldn't handle it because they knew that a Rebbe says Chassidus day and night, and here the Rebbe is so b'tzimtzum, so in Zman Rimizak, and they couldn't find the place themselves by the new Rebbe who was so cheap about the limit of Chassidus. But that's what this Hayom means. In the beginning of his Nesias, Menachem was shorter, and as the Nesias proceeded, it became longer and longer and longer. By the time the middle of the Stalik was a sea, mamish, a yam, an ocean. They were swimming in an ocean of Dach, an ocean of Chassidus. And the Hasbara bepashtis, I mean, I don't know for sure. The Hasbara bepashtis, the Yom is that the Mitteler Rebbe created his generation. He started off slow. He raised his Chassidim up, and as the Chassidim became able to concentrate longer and better and deeper, the Mamorim became bigger and longer until it was mamish asazai liyasad lavi. The only issue is going to be is knowing about a lakus. The whole world is full of Yidis Hashem. The Mitteler Rebbe does always give fear. The Mitteler Rebbe brought this out in his time, in his generation, for his Chassidim. That's the pshat of this entry. But I want to finish with a dreyanish. There is a mistake. It says Admor Azokan Hayom betchil umarim ktsar. It should say Admor Hem Tzai. But the Rebbe once said about the Avram Parish, Avram's Greisen darf man lernen. This is a mistake in the Hayom. You have to for sure learn it. So I'm going to tell you what you have in a different Hayom, but this I'm going to make Bekitzer. When the Alter Rebbe became a Rebbe, he said very short taters, a line, mamish, a few words. And they were Dvarim Cheitzvei La'aveseish, they were not Chabad, they were fire, they went straight into the Neshama. And in order to get those taters, you have to be a Ishmerubim, a higher person. And over the course of his Nesias, and we have a lot of Mamorim, we have them, they're printed. His Mamorim changed. They became a little longer, and then even longer, and then they became the full Mamorim of Chassidus Chabad that we know from the Likutei Torah and from the Sfarim and so on. But the Alter Rebbe changed also in the beginning very short, and later longer and longer to have the full Chabad. But in the case of the Alter Rebbe, he was literally creating Chabad. He was bringing Chabad into the world. In the case of the Mitteler Rebbe, he wasn't creating Chabad, he was developing Chabad. But he knew you can't develop Chabad without Makablim. The Talmidim have to keep up, the Chassidim have to Mittal. And then it's Ashpa. This story is about the Mitteler Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe went through 4 stages. In the beginning they were very short, and then they became longer, and even longer, and even longer. But this vort is about the Mitteler Rebbe. Okay? We'll continue next Sunday, Mitzvah Hashem, B'li Neder.